Meanwhile, North Korea is now pledging to strengthen its ties with Communist China. State media is reporting that the Hermit Kingdom's foreign minister expressed North Korea's desire to, quote, further develop the traditional relations of friendship and cooperation in a meeting with China's ambassador to Pyongyang. North Korea also releasing a statement of support for Russia, acknowledging it is Victory Day holiday earlier this week. Joining me right now is Atlas Organization founder and the author of the must-read The Decisive Decade. Jonathan D.T. is here right now. Jonathan, always congratulations on the book. Good to see you and how it's doing so well. Your thoughts on North Korea wanting more time and friendship with China?
Absolutely. Well, great to be back, Maria. And I think we're seeing this little axis consolidate. We're back, in a sense, to the very early days of the Cold War with the same characters engaged. I mean, on one hand, we've already seen that North Korea sold millions of, artillery shells to Moscow. And then, of course, Iran is providing drones and Beijing is providing financing to Putin's war in Ukraine. So if we think back to the 1950s, where Stalin and Mao got together and initiated the Korean War, this is the same sort of set of characters plus a few extras, but we're back to very dangerous days. And of course, with Kim Jong-un, there's been a sort of lull in the North Korea-China relationship for a few years, but I think he's trying to reconstitute it if these meetings are to be believed. On the other hand, there's a whole lot of sort of high talk from Chinese and North Korean leaders. It's not necessarily something that we'll have to see what the results are.
In part 2 of the book, you write about the diplomatic arena and how the global chessboard is changing. I want to get your take on others away from the United States and their partnership with China, because Italy is now planning to hold talks with China after reportedly signaling plans to pull out of Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative. Bloomberg reported this earlier this week that Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni told House Speaker Kevin McCarthy in Rome that Rome is favoring an exit from the pact last week. Jonathan, this is interesting that Italy would want to push away from Communist China.
Well, this is very good, and let's hope this happens. Italy was one of the first countries to go into China's Belt and Road. I mean, the Belt and Road really is about getting into Europe. It's about consolidating a whole bunch of continents, basically Africa, Europe, Indian Ocean, the entire region. They'd like to pull all of that, the Eurasian supercontinental structure, into an economic community with China at the center. And our own allies in Europe, I mean, some of them have really looked at that initiative and said there are going to be benefits, particularly in Southern Europe. And as we remember in the early Cold War, I mean, the Marshall Plan was very focused on Southern Europe, on Italy and Greece. I mean, we had to go and basically combat the Soviet Union with economic aid to make sure that those states didn't swing to the other side. So I think it's very concerning to look at Southern European nations that need infrastructure and investment and have sought it in China. And if they're going to do a sea change here, because Europe really has woken up after Ukraine, I mean, that has changed the game for them a lot. They can understand what's wrong with engagement with the Russia-China bloc. I mean, Eastern Europe certainly understands it because they went through communism, but a lot of Western and Southern Europe is still just looking for trade and investment, and that's where we have to cement our transatlantic ties. I mean, we're going to need Europe to win the long game with China. Together with Europe, we're 50% of the global GDP, and that's the best path to victory.
I like the fact that Meloni sees this with clear eyes, the Prime Minister of Italy, and understands the threat. A couple of years ago, we were talking about how Germany was adopting Huawei products, and I was thinking, well, wait a second. If Huawei is all throughout Europe, they've got surveillance right there underway. They're being spied on by the Communist Party of China, correct?
Well, sure. I mean, any, Huawei in a country is not a good thing, and we've, I think, demonstrated that, and a lot of the alliance system has thrown it out, but Huawei is thriving in the emerging world, from Brazil to Indonesia to Africa, so that's a pretty big problem. And back to the subject of Germany, I mean, the Chinese foreign minister is now threatening the German foreign minister about potential sanctions on Chinese banks and companies that are aiding the Russian war effort. I think, we have to understand that's probably exactly where we need to focus as an alliance system. I mean, Chinese companies have been thriving in the Russian market under the direct guidance from the state. I mean, their own ambassador said, hey, let's stay in here as everybody else is leaving Russia. So they're building and funding and supplying Putin's war effort.
By the way, they've been thriving in America, too. There was a memorandum of understanding that was signed by Joe Biden back in 2013, which allowed hundreds of Chinese companies to trade on our exchanges and not follow any auditing rules. Right. I mean, no wonder China has been able to get inside the gates of America. Now you've got China's securities watchdog saying this morning that it is willing to work with the U.S. counterparts to promote audit regulatory cooperation. audit regulatory cooperation, whatever that means, and to safeguard the interests of global investors. The U.S. Public Company Accounting Oversight Board finding deficiencies in audits of U.S.-listed Chinese companies conducted by KPMG in China and PwC in Hong Kong. The U.S. accounting watchdog gaining access to Chinese companies' auditors' records for the first time last year in a move to keep about 200 Chinese companies from being kicked off these U.S. exchanges. As I said, it all started when Joe Biden allowed these companies to trade on our exchanges without following auditing rules. And now we've got China at least trying to say that it's willing to start following auditing rules. I don't know if we should believe this or what. How do you see this playing out?
Well, look, yeah, the PCAOB found that these companies failed to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence, so weren't really, apparently doing the job. And then, these two auditors, which are Western companies, I mean, they're China offices. I mean, you could look at this and, what's the conflict of interest there? I mean, if they're basically over in China with Chinese staff looking at Chinese companies in order and not performing the service correctly. And, by the way, one of these companies has gone on a massive hiring spree in China, looking to double the size of its staff up to 20,000 people and investing over $1 billion in expanding in China over the years. So I think we have this problem when there's a China office that's trying to perform services that have to do with U.S.-China global competition. That's going to be an issue for any sort of multinational firm that maintains offices worldwide and yet is sort of in an old mindset of, full-on globalization and not realizing how much the geopolitics are going to bifurcate the system and force us into necessary competition. And we need companies on our side. And I think the longer that they remain the sort of globally integrated enterprise, the more they're missing the picture. The
more these companies raise their hand and say these Chinese companies are not giving us access, are not following the auditing rules, the more they could get a target on their back. Look what just happened to Bain.
Yep.
Okay, so the CCP goes into the Bain offices in Shanghai and they raid it and they question people. I'm sure KPMG and PwC are thinking, well, am I next?
Well, sure.
To get a raid.
And this must have been before the raid. I mean, and the raid I think was a signal to many companies that are over there. And by the way, when it comes to auditing that's based on evidence, I mean, China's going after the ability to collect evidence on its market, which even the U.S. Chamber of Commerce points out that's fundamental to investment decisions overseas. So they don't want us to have full transparency.
Jonathan, thank you for writing this book. It is a must-read. We appreciate you, The Decisive Decade. Jonathan D.T. Ward. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.